Welcome to the English BookCast. And today we're diving deep, real deep, into a book that, it's called Our Atlantean Heritage. It's by Alexandre Braghine. Have you heard of it?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a classic in alternative history circles. Definitely sparks some interesting thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. Before we really jump in, just a quick reminder to everyone listening. If you're enjoying these deep dives, exploring these kind of out there ideas, please hit that subscribe button for the English Bookcast channel. And if you think someone you know would dig this, share it around. It really helps us out.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about getting these ideas out there, you know? More minds thinking about this stuff, the better.
Absolutely. Now, this book, Our Atlantean Heritage, you actually sent this one my way, right?
Yeah, I did. It's one of those books that really just gets you thinking, you know? About the past, about civilizations, about what we really know. I thought you'd be interested.
I am. I mean, Atlantis. Come on, who isn't
Yeah.
fascinated by that? So I guess our mission today is to kind of unpack Braghine's theories, see what kind of evidence he's bringing to the table.
Exactly. We're going to dive deep into our Atlantean heritage, follow his arguments, and see where it leads us. All based on this book, of course. No outside stuff.
Right, sticking to the source material here.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into it. The first chapter, it tackles the age of the Earth and humanity's origins, all that big stuff. And one of the things that jumped out at me right away was this debate about how old the Earth actually is. Like, there was some real disagreement in the early scientific community, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. You had these two main camps, right? The
Right.
astronomers, folks like Lord Kelvin, Henri Poincaré, they were looking at the Earth basically as a big pooling rock.
Makes sense.
So they did all these calculations about how long it would take for, this molten ball of stuff to cool down to what we see today. And they came up with, well, a pretty young Earth, something like tens of millions of years old.
Which, thinking about it now, sounds like nothing. But back then, that was a huge deal, right?
It was the scientific consensus at the time, based on the physics they knew. And this is important, I think. Even what seems like solid science can change, as we learn more. Kelvin and Poincaré, they were brilliant guys working with the best knowledge they had.
Right. Science is always evolving,
Yeah,
always questioning.
exactly. And that's what makes it so cool.
Totally. But then you had the geologists who were coming at it from a totally different angle, right?
Completely different. They weren't so focused on the heat, but on the actual stuff of the Earth itself, the rocks, the layers, all of it. And they were seeing all this evidence of erosion, deposition, all these slow processes that had to take like huge amounts of time.
I can imagine.
Yeah. We're talking hundreds of millions of years minimum just for the Earth's crust to form. So you had this clash, right? Astronomers saying young Earth, geologists saying nope, much older.
A real battle of the clocks.
You got it. And it wasn't just about the age of the Earth. Braghine also talks about these specific periods, the geological and quaternary periods, and how even within those huge chunks of time, pinpointing exact dates was super difficult.
Yeah, it makes sense. Dating things that old, even now, it can't be easy.
Definitely not. And Braghine emphasizes that uncertainty. So you've got this backdrop of immense time, these periods stretching back millions of years, and it's within that time frame that, according to Braghine, the story of humanity starts to emerge.
Okay, so where does he put our earliest ancestors then? In this timeline, I mean.
Well, he talks about humans, hominids, showing up pretty early on, like way back in the tertiary period. That's the period before the quaternary, the one we're in now. We're talking like 66 million to 2.6 million years ago. And then he says the genus Homo shows up the early quaternary, like 125,000 to 100,000 years ago for the first Homo species.
Okay, so that Homo time frame is kind of closer to what we understand now, right? But hominids in the tertiary, that's pretty different from what most scientists say today, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But back then, there were these discoveries of Simiadae fossils in the tertiary layers, in Europe mostly. Greece, Switzerland, places like that. These were ancient primates, pre-apes even. And some people thought, hey, maybe these are the super early ancestors of humans. We know more now, of course.
Right. The fossil record was a lot more patchy back then. It's like trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. And sometimes you think you've got the right piece, but then you find a new one that changes everything.
And it wasn't just the bones, right?
hmm
Broad mentions these tools that were found, super old tools that some people thought were proof of, like really early humans in Europe.
Yeah, the Pliocene tools. The Pliocene is just before the Pleistocene, which is part of the Quaternary. And these tools were found in England, in places like Ipswich, Norwich, even near Salisbury. They were pretty basic, though. primitive tools.
Right, right. I imagine we're not talking about, like, smartphones here.
No, definitely not. But these finds, they got people thinking, how far back does human history in Europe really go? Of course, now we have better ways of dating things, and some of those tools, well, they might not be human-made after all. Sometimes nature can trick you.
Makes sense.
So yeah, lots of debate back then about what these tools meant.
Braghine also talks about those skeletons, the Galley Hill one in England and the Olmo one in Italy. They were found in these really old layers, but there's all this controversy about how old they really were, wasn't there?
Huge controversy. Some people were saying, look, this proves that humans were in Europe way earlier than we thought, but others were skeptical. They thought maybe those skeletons were buried later and somehow ended up in those older layers. Like imagine digging a grave, but you accidentally dig down into much older soil.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about the age of the bones themselves, but how they got there.
Exactly. Context is key, right? And back then, the science of dating things, it was still pretty new, so there was a lot of room for different interpretations.
And then Braghine jumps across the ocean to South America. He talks about those discoveries in Brazil, the Lagoa Santa skeletons,
Ah, yes. Those are interesting finds.
because they suggested that maybe, just maybe, there were humans in South America even earlier than those migrations from Asia across the Bering Strait.
Right. That was the big idea, wasn't it? That maybe these Lagoa Santa folks were a whole different human lineage, Homo americanus, and that they evolved in South America completely separate from those Asian migrations.
Whole different branch of the human family tree. Pretty wild to think about.
Absolutely. And even though that Homo americanus idea hasn't really held up, it shows you that the story of humans in the Americas, it might be a lot more complicated than we thought.
Way more twists and turns.
Yeah.
Okay, so after all that deep time stuff, all the debate about how old the Earth is and when humans showed up, Braghine goes in a kind of different direction. He starts talking about giant reptiles, dinosaurs. And, well, this is where things get a little more, shall we say, controversial.
You could say that. Chapter 2 of our Atlantean Heritage, it's a wild ride. So he starts with the Mesozoic era, the age of the dinosaurs. Big, scary lizards everywhere. And of course, they all died out, right? Long before humans came along, at least according to mainstream science.
Right, millions of years before.
Yeah.
But then Braghine brings up these archaeological findings in Siberia, I think, that he says point to humans and dinosaurs living at the same time, which I gotta say, sounds pretty hard to believe.
Yeah, it's definitely outside the mainstream view. Now, the book mentions these Siberian findings, but it doesn't really go into detail about what they actually are. And it's important to remember the scientific consensus, based on tons of evidence, fossils, dating methods, all that, it says humans and dinosaurs, they didn't overlap like that.
Okay, so that's a pretty big gap between what Braghine's saying and what, most scientists think.
Huge gap. But Braghine, he's got a different perspective. He sees all these legends, myths about dragons, winged serpents, all these reptilian monsters, and he thinks, maybe these aren't just stories. Maybe they're memories.
Memories of actual dinosaurs. I mean, that's a pretty wild idea, but I can see how it's kind of appealing.
It is appealing, isn't it? It
Yeah.
taps into that fascination we all have with dinosaurs, with monsters, with the idea that maybe, just maybe, there are things out there we don't fully understand.
For sure. And he points to these myths from all over the world, right? China, Japan, India, Europe, the Americas. It's like a global phenomenon.
It really is. And Braghine's argument is, look, how could all these cultures so far apart all come up with the same basic idea of a dragon unless there was something real behind it?
Makes you wonder. Then he brings in that famous expedition, the one that found dinosaur eggs in Mongolia, led by Roy Chapman Andrews, right?
Yeah, the Andrews expedition, that was a big deal in the 1920s. Front page news, they found all these dinosaur eggs in the Gobi Desert, really captured the public imagination. And I think Braghine is using that excitement about dinosaurs to set the stage for his own ideas.
Like, hey, everyone's thinking about dinosaurs now, so let's talk about humans living alongside them.
Exactly. And he goes on to mention other discoveries, fossils, and tools found together that he says point to humans and dinosaurs being contemporaries. But again, he doesn't give us the specifics. He doesn't tell us which scientists, which studies, which digs.
So we can't really check those claims.
Not without more information. And that's something to keep in mind, right? When you're reading anything, especially something like this that's challenging the mainstream view, you got to ask, what's the evidence? Can I verify this?
Good point. Healthy skepticism is always a good thing.
Absolutely. Braghine also brings up some interesting archaeological sites. There's one in Romania at Atlântida where there are these drawings that some people think show a dinosaur. And then there are those famous cave paintings in France, in the Ariège region.
Oh, yeah, those are amazing.
They are. But here's the thing. Those French cave paintings, they mostly show animals that early humans did live alongside. Mammoths, rhinoceroses, things like that. But whether any of those paintings actually show dinosaurs, well, that's highly debated.
So it's all about interpretation, right? What one person sees as a dinosaur, another person might see as something totally different.
You got it. It's like looking at clouds. Everyone sees something different.
And then there's that story about human footprints found next to dinosaur footprints in the Gobi Desert, also by the Andrews expedition. That sounds like pretty solid evidence, if it's true.
It would be huge. But there's no real scientific backing for that claim. No peer-reviewed studies, no confirmation from other experts. Over the years, there have been lots of these human footprint next to dinosaur footprint stories, but they've always turned out to be something else. Misidentified dinosaur tracks, weird erosion patterns, even hoaxes.
So probably not real then.
Most likely not. Which brings us back to that idea of healthy skepticism. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right?
Makes sense. Okay, so we've gone through this whole thing about humans, maybe, possibly, living alongside dinosaurs.
Yeah.
But then in Chapter 3, Braghine takes a pretty sharp turn. He starts talking about the spiritual level of these pre-human races.
Yeah, it's a shift from the physical to the metaphysical. Braghine says that all these pre-human races, they had different spiritual levels, and that over time, that spiritual capacity evolved, step by step, until you get to Homo sapiens. And even suggests that we as modern humans, we might have these kind of dreamlike memories of those earlier epochs buried deep in our subconscious.
It's like that Jungian idea of the collective unconscious, right? Those ancient memories that we all share, even if we don't know it.
Exactly. Braghine's tapping into that. He's saying that maybe those myths we talked about, those legends of dragons and lost civilizations, maybe they're not just historical accounts, but also reflections of these deep subconscious memories from those pre-human times. Pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And this leads into talk about the idea of advanced pre-human civilizations, right? Societies that were super advanced, but then got wiped out by some kind of cataclysm.
Right. Sunken continents, vanished cities, all that. It's a classic theme in lost civilization theories. And Braghine's saying, maybe there's some truth to these stories. Maybe there are these incredible societies that existed long before what we consider history, and then, boom, gone.
Wiped out by a flood, a meteor, who knows?
Exactly.
Lost to time. And then he brings in the work of Dr. L.S.B. Leakey, the famous paleoanthropologist. Leakey's discoveries in Africa, they really changed how we understand human origins. They pushed the timeline back way further.
So how does that fit into Braghine's theory?
Well, Braghine uses Leakey's work to argue that human history, it's even longer and more complex than we thought. Which means there's more room for those lost civilizations to have existed. More time for them to rise and fall.
The deeper we dig, the more possibilities open up. And then Brian gets into this whole thing about pygmy races, the small-statured populations found all over the world. What's his take on them? He looks at those populations in Africa, Asia, Oceania, the Americas, and he discusses all these theories about them. Were they the original inhabitants? Are they remnants of ancient migrations? Do they represent like an earlier stage of human evolution? It was a lot of speculation, really.
And he ties this back to the idea of a complex prehistory, right? These different groups interacting, maybe even clashing, long before recorded history.
Right. And he also points out that many of these pygmy groups, they have traditions, stories that say they're the original people of their land, that they were there before anyone else. Braghine seems to think that maybe those traditions, those stories, they hold some truth, that they're echoes of that distant past.
It's like he's piecing together this big puzzle using everything he can find. Scientific evidence, myths, legends, local traditions.
Exactly. He's pulling it all together.
And of course he has to mention giants, right?
Yeah.
No talk about ancient mysteries is complete without giants.
Of course. Braghine talks about those giant myths that are found everywhere, and he even mentions some archaeological findings that have been interpreted as evidence of, like, really tall human ancestors. Big bones, huge tools, that kind of thing.
So giants roaming the earth.
Well, that's what some people believe. But mainstream science, they usually have a different explanation. Those big bones, they're probably from extinct animals like mammoths or giant sloths. And those big tools, well, maybe they were just used for special purposes, or maybe the stories about them just got exaggerated over time.
The telephone game of history.
Yeah, things get distorted. But Braghine, he's open to the possibility of giants.
Open to all possibilities. And he also mentions those legends of white races that supposedly predate the current populations in certain places, like the Guanches in the Canary Islands and the Basques in Spain.
Right. He doesn't go into too much detail, but it fits into his overall idea of this like super diverse prehistory with all these different groups moving around, interacting, disappearing.
A world we can barely imagine. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the age of the Earth, the possibility of humans living alongside dinosaurs, the spiritual evolution of pre-human races, all sorts of wild stuff. And it's all based on Braghine's interpretation of the evidence as he understood it back then.
Exactly. We've just scratched the surface of our Atlantean heritage, but it's given us a good taste of Braghine's ideas.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about. Like, what other assumptions do we make about history that might be worth questioning? What other mysteries are out there waiting to be uncovered?
Big questions, the kind that keep us exploring, keep us learning.
And if you're as fascinated by these questions as we are, well, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button for the English BookCast channel and tell your friends. Let's get more people thinking about these amazing mysteries.
Absolutely. The more the merrier.
Thanks again for sharing this book with me. It's been a wild ride.
My pleasure. Always happy to share a good book.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into our Atlantean heritage. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds open.